Gumede is attending the summit. Good afternoon, Arabile.
Well, of course, the Discovery Leadership Summit 2018 has brought about some fascinating names, of course, here to South Africa's shores to unpack not just leadership, but clearly how South Africa can aid itself in the investment community, aid itself when it comes to growth, and of course, enabling the global community to understand South Africa perhaps a little bit better. Perhaps sharing some words of wisdom may indeed be helpful in a time where South Africa is going through some change, whether it be political, whether it be economic as well. One of those economic powerhouses that we've continuously focused on, of course, is BRICS. But we chat now to the gentleman who, of course, has coined the BRIC term initially before South Africa even joined, Lord Jim O'Neill. So thank you so much for your time, Jim. It's really been a fascinating time for South Africa, particularly since the end of last year. Yeah. What do you make of the leadership squabbles, if you want to call it that have happened not just in South Africa, but across the emerging market space, really?
Part of life. On one level, it's part of normal life. The idea that leaders don't squabble, it would be kind of naive. What is slightly puzzling is that we seem to have had a lot about the same time, which adds to the troublesome global nature of it. As it relates to South Africa, and I'll partly try and start answering you in an encouraging way, I'm hopeful that under the new presidential leadership, particularly with him appointing an old friend of mine, Tito Mboweni, as finance minister, maybe South Africa's going back to a more stable era. Because when I look at it from 40,000 feet post-apartheid, the first decade was pretty cool. The second one's been a bit wasted. Too much squabbling, not enough focus on the issues that should matter, and South Africa's lost its way.
What are those issues that you feel perhaps should matter indeed and should be a focal point for South Africa?
So when it comes to economics, linked to why I said the first decade was so cool and why having somebody like Tito involved is hopefully good, is despite the social need to put in place a framework for a new country, South Africa smartly adopted the best of Western practices on fiscal and monetary policy. But they've been tampered with a lot the past decade. And that's partly why I think South Africa's struggled, as well as nowhere near genuine sufficient focus on the productivity challenge. And there was certainly plenty of focus on monetary and fiscal stability in the first decade. Not enough then even on productivity, but the second decade, there wasn't focus on any of these things. Hopefully we now can enter a new era where the monetary and fiscal stability is restored, but there's more serious focus on things to boost South Africa's productivity as well.
Would you say this is normal, though, in the sense that you get to a point where, yes, you reach a new dawn, that's particularly 1994 from there, and yes, the first decade is amazing because now you have the sense of freedom, the sense of understanding, and then you perhaps reach some sort of a lull or complacency almost, and that's that kind of what some may say happened. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I'll give you three answers that might sort of contradict themselves in a way. First of all, I don't know. The idea that I'm got special insights for South Africa, I wouldn't like to be so arrogant or naive. However, secondly, I don't think it could be described as normal because South Africa's history and how it got to 94 is so unique. So there are some genuine, unique, deep social structural issues that South Africa's had to and still getting to grips with. However, and here's the bit that's slightly contradictory and a little bit controversial, I guess, is I often sort of have felt, not in a derogatory way, but wanting to say that South Africa has to sort of, in some ways, stop feeling sorry for itself. Because the only people that can control South Africa's destiny, really, is South Africa. And I love to give the example of South Korea, which is some people are like, well, what's that got to do with South Africa? But not two different sized populations. A country that 40 years ago had the wealth of a typical sub-Saharan country, But today, and by the way, had its own very troubled past, because we have North Korea, so very different sort of troubled past, but a big troubled past. But today, South Korea has the same wealth as Spain. And so there are examples around the world how you can change for the better. And what's really important in South Korea's case is it's one of the more equally shared wealth countries in the world. A lot of other countries have become wealthy for the elites, but not had it shared. And I think, given South Africa's past, it needs it to be shared. But there are examples of how to do it with more likely success, particularly as it relates to the adoption of technology and how to attract foreign investments and how to have good governance standards that I think South Africa can think a bit more about.
South Africa has tended to lean a lot more as well on its partners, and one of those big partners we saw earlier this year was the BRICS nations.
Yeah.
In this day and age, however, considering that China seems to be the holding force behind the BRICS at this point, do you think it still holds relevance? Is it just China and the rest?
It's a very pertinent question. Again, I've got slightly contradictory thoughts. I mean, the reality is, this decade so far, China is the linchpin of the world economy. Just below half of all nominal GDP growth since 2010 for the world has come from China. I love to often say that America's most iconic company, Apple, and its iPhones, has become somewhat dependent on its sales to China. And so obviously in the BRICS group, it is mammothly dominant. China today is 6 times bigger than the second biggest BRIC country, India. I'm fond of often saying that it creates another South Africa every 3 months. And it's bigger than all the other BRICS put together, double. So yeah, economically, it's enormously dominant. And without China's interest, you know, what would the BRICS thing be? However, here's the contradictory part. China, slightly beautifully, likes to regard itself as the champion of the emerging world. And particularly for South Africa, as evidenced in some of its decisions, it likes this idea of South Africa being some kind of gateway for sub-Saharan Africa as well. So I don't think the BRICS thing is redundant. It needs to find better purpose. There's a number of areas where I'd love to see the BRICS leaders be more specific and doing things about. Solving the TB drug-resistant problem. A problem that all 5 BRICS countries severely threatened by. Why can't the BRICS Bank finance some initiatives for the search for new drugs that aren't resistant to antibiotics, for example?
You spoke about leadership. One of the nations within the BRICS nation is entirely struggling with that leadership cause. A number of presidents over the last few years, and now having just recently elected a president as well in Brazil.
Yeah.
How difficult is it, do you think, for Brazil to remain within a corporation that is trying to aid an emerging market growth picture when they seem to be struggling for themselves?
So on my way here, I read a very interesting focus on the new Brazilian president, as there are in many newspapers. And he seems to like to be described as the Trump of Brazil, which is intriguing. And as strange as Donald Trump might be, actually what that probably does mean, that immediately he will be able to link into Trump and America, probably much better than Brazilian leaders for at least the past decade, if not longer. And so there is some tactical advantage for that. The second thing I would say is, despite what a turbulent decade so far this has been for Brazil, it's actually still as big as Italy. And people forget that the first decade of BRIC life, it's 17 years, the first 10 years, Brazil did rather well. And it became much bigger than Italy 15 years earlier than I said it would. So it can cope with a lost decade. What it can't do is cope with a second lost decade. And so this new leader needs to somehow adapt himself to the reality of what he's found himself in and put Brazil in a better framework for sustainable growth, which, by the way, is also not so dependent on commodity prices, because otherwise they will have the same roller coaster ride that Brazil has had throughout its history.
And ultimately, just its role then in BRICS, do you feel? Is it, I mean, we could question, as we've said, the role of all the countries really outside of China in that BRICS grouping, but Brazil itself right now, seeing the turbulence happening there, you think it still has a relevant role within the BRICS?
I definitely think it does, not least because according to my information, the whole BRICS political leaders group was originally started by the Russians and the Brazilians. It was really those two countries that came up with the idea. And I can't imagine the senior bureaucratic machinery of Brazil wanting to give up that position, because despite all its problems, here is a grouping that does get world attention, that doesn't involve the United States or Europe. And just that in itself should attract Brazil to wanting to be part of it still. Yeah. And even though they've got problems, you know, they bring things to it. You know, they are one of the most important agricultural producers in the world. They are one of the greatest sporting nations in the world. They have some of the most beautiful ecological destinations and issues. So I think they certainly have something to offer, but I think I'd like to see, for all the BRICS, Brazil included, the following question answered by each of the BRICS leaders, by themselves and collectively. What can they do between themselves which would allow the collective economic performance of all five do better? Otherwise, what's the point?
Indeed. Very finally, you did touch on it now, but I wanted to get perhaps a final sort of message, not just to South Africa, but to the local investment community as well, to say, you know, these are perhaps focus points for you to aid your growth, to aid further investment and push on beyond where you currently sit.
So I'll say two things about that. First of all, one of the few things I've learned in over 30-odd years of finance, never let a crisis go to waste. I mean, crises happen. That is, people try to kid themselves that if we do this, that and the other, we'll never have a crisis. In my view, that's just naive. You know, crises in finance and economics, they come around because of, at one end you've got greed and the other end you've got fear. And they're natural. But the key thing is how to make yourself structurally better, so for when the next one comes, you're less vulnerable. So South Africa's got to think more strongly about that. And then secondly with it, focus through, both domestically and internationally, the genuine uniquity that South Africa has to offer. And if it can restore the monetary and fiscal credibility that it had over 10 years ago, actually that's something that nowhere else in Africa's got, or at least anywhere that's big. And that in itself is an immediate attraction to so many investors around the world that want to get exposed to Nigeria, Ethiopia, all sorts of exotic and risky places elsewhere in the continent, that if South Africa has a stable framework, it can really benefit the rest of the continent, but also itself. But with it, the last thing is, it needs to be more serious, in my view, about doing things to raise the education and skills attainment of the most disadvantaged people. Because otherwise, its long-term fortunes will remain weak, despite whatever is said by me or anybody else.
I think that's a shared sentiment by quite a few. Lord Jim O'Neill, really appreciate your time, and I really hope you enjoy your time here in South Africa as well. As you've just heard the sentiments, the thoughts, perhaps investing in the right places and looking towards the right kind of investment in South Africa, not just throwing money at the problem, but throwing the right kind of situational investment into it all. The Discovery Leadership Summit 2018, of course, bringing the likes of Bill Clinton, as I said a little bit earlier, Hillary Clinton as well, even the likes of Caster Semenya speaking at the summit this time around. It is certainly a summit that has given South Africa a chance to portray itself in the right light at the back of the investment summit, at the back of that MTBPS as well in 2018. That is where we conclude for now. Back to you in studio.